What is neoliberalism? Neoliberalism is a term that's a derogatory slur used against those who support capitalism, so whether you're a true conservative or those who support libertarianism, it's used to describe that of the transition between socialism to capitalism. And of course it was used as well under Ronald Reagan's era, as well of course Margaret Thatcher. It's best to use Great Britain as the illustrated example, because before Margaret Thatcher you had the heavy nationalisation. Britain was the most heavily nationalised economy outside the communist world. Along came Margaret Thatcher and it was this period of deregulation, privatisation, and you could also use this term in terms of Sweden, because Sweden from 1960s onwards until the early 90s saw heavy nationalisation, the strong government regulation, all of this that led to the economic stagnation and the eventual crisis that they would face by the beginning of the 90s, just like that of what Margaret Thatcher did with the privatisation and deregulation to an extent. You would see the same thing with Sweden after the crisis that they hit. Neoliberalism is basically a term used for the transition. The problem with it is the very fact that we didn't transit towards capitalism, maybe in a question of scale. You're living under a mixed economy, so it wasn't like as if to say we moved towards this free market economy, as if to say we live under this capitalist system, because we don't. And you heard a lot of these critiques of the period under Margaret Thatcher, and they try to claim that they're living under this capitalist system. You've seen this too often. I mean, you heard it from the likes of Second Thought.
This is simply the natural conclusion of the hyper-capitalist system we have in the United States.
You've heard it from Joe Scott.
One of them you have to point to and give credit to is the economic model that made all this possible, and the dominant economic model over the past 200 years has been capitalism.
All of these, socialists that are heavily critical of capitalism. Of course, you get philosophy trib as well.
Remember in episode 2 we talked about the link between liberalism and capitalism? Well, neoliberalism is like the twisted love child of the two.
So this is what they try to describe as neoliberal.
So quick background on the ideological roots of neoliberalism. Well, as its prefix neo, which means new, suggests, it is an adaptation of classical liberal theory, which originated in the 1800s.
One of the most erroneous arguments you heard about this neoliberalism was the period of this so-called deregulation. So they claim erroneously that we live under this unfettered capitalism. There is only two types of regulation. There is capitalism and then there is socialism on a question of scale. Capitalism's about the market regulating itself, so there's no such thing as this unfettered capitalism unless they're talking about government's regulation. Unfettered should more appropriately be known as a self-regulating market economy. You could take the example of quality of produce. Now, consumers themselves in a free market economy will go into stores and they will determine what the quality is. You see that even today, people walk into grocery stores, they pick up goods like bananas or apples or tomatoes, and of course they look at the quality for themselves, they judge whether they want to put it in their basket or not, and that's what you call the market self-regulating, because it's actually the consumer that's determining whether they wish to buy it or not. You could make the argument to say, well, the consumer will make poor choices. Sure enough, it's down to an individual's responsibility. But even then, if of course something does go wrong, it's because of market pressure, because of consumer demand. As a result of competition, it brought in return services. This is why in businesses you see return services, 30-day money-back guarantee. Even if consumers were to buy products that, of course, weren't up to standard, the consumer does have a right to take that back. And it was because of capitalism that enabled that to happen. It didn't come around because, government regulation stepped in and made this happen. Whereas when you talk about socialism on the question of scale, socialism would be about stepping in with controls over the market. So you see the government's regulation. Going back to the argument on deregulation having caused the banking crisis, the reason why they're so desperate to correlate this system today with being capitalist as being a capitalist system is because they've got this emotional investment in hating capitalism, just as they have this emotional investment in supporting socialism. That is to say, they're not interested in the actual truth. They need something to make capitalism look bad. So in other words, they will look at this system today, they'll call it capitalism, regardless of, you telling them that capitalism is about the separation of the economy from government. They won't listen to you. It's two fingers in the ears. They're not interested because they need something to make capitalism look bad in order to garner support for socialism. It's the only way that they can garner support. In other words, they want you to believe that capitalism doesn't work, therefore you need to usher in socialism. And so it's a way to basically try and convince people, here's why you should support socialism. There's dishonesty. They don't want to hear the truth. For any of you who are open-minded and willing to learn, this is a mixed economy. It's basically the mixture between capitalism and socialism. And as a result of strangling capitalism half to death, strangling the private sector half to death through all the strong government regulation, using all these subsidies, etc., it led to this very crisis of what we saw. The bad banks became too big to fail. You saw the socialist fixing of the interest rates that caused the boom and bust cycle, and it was no different in this, scenario. Because there was a shortage of savings, they artificially reduced the interest rates. It created a boom because consumers went out and rushed out to basically borrow more. And so since people were borrowing more from low interest rates, they were seeking housing, and of course it created a housing bubble. The bubble is basically that of inflation. When consumer demand dries up in an area of a shortage, you're inevitably going to be faced with this issue. And it was the style of economy of buy now, pay later. It's all the credit. So it's all the borrowing that was, that led to this very problem. And the bad banks, those, of special interest favours, were being protected by that of government through the socialist subsidies. So in other words, the taxpayer was forced to pay for it all. So this is the very reason why you would see the crisis. It wasn't so much to do with regulation per se, it was actually to do with the fact that bad banks were getting away with legally protected fraud because of government was there to constantly protect them. You can even hear this argument here by Edward J. Griffin.
When people say down with capitalism, they're usually saying down with private ownership. They do not want individuals to own anything. What they really want is for the commissars and the administrators of the state to own everything. That's really what they're saying. And if they understood that, I don't think they'd be quite as enthusiastic about it. And the other part of the problem is that the banking crisis today has nothing to do with private ownership of property. The banking crisis is a result of fraud, and it's a result of legally protected fraud, which means that the bankers and the politicians have gone into partnership together. And the trouble we're having with the banks is that the government is protecting the banks, keeping them from failing, supposedly in the benefit of the people, you help the people and all of that, but it doesn't help the people. It puts the people further into debt. It inflates the prices of everything. Meanwhile, the bankers are doing quite well, thank you. Those bankers are not capitalists. Most of those bankers, I guess the best word you would say for them is they're collectivists, which is another word of saying socialists.
Again, to back up this point, you could even listen to this of Daniel Hannan, who explains about that of the Financial Services Authority.
There is a world of difference between being pro-business and being pro-market. Sometimes those two positions happen to coincide, often they do not. Corporatism is not the same thing as capitalism, failure of capitalism. I mean, I can't believe I'm having to come to the Oxford Union and explain that subsidies and nationalizations are the opposite of capitalism. And yet that seems to be the contention of the Occupy crowd. Now, in a capitalist system, bad banks would have failed, their profitable operations would have been sold to more efficient competitors, bondholders would have lost money, shareholders would have lost money, some depositors would have lost money, taxpayers would not have contributed a penny. The failure of a business and its replacement by a rival is not a sign that the capitalist system isn't working. It's a sign that the capitalist system is working, just as you weed your garden to make space for new growth. It's precisely that replacement of inefficient old producers by better new ones that has raised humanity to the highest standard of living we have ever enjoyed. Now you might say, well, all right, but what about the regulation? Well, we heard it from 2 or 3 of the speakers on the other side. There wasn't proper regulation. Just ask yourselves, with the exception of nuclear power, possibly of some television broadcasting, what industry is more regulated than financial services? The FSA handbook, the guide on how to comply with their regulations, is 10,500 pages long. The idea that this was a failure of regulation is the opposite of the truth, and that is an extremely dangerous mistake to make. Because by responding to the crisis with further regulation, we repeat the mistakes that led to it in the first place, and we make the next one likely. Why? It was the cost of compliance that drove the small providers out of the market. It was the regulation that forced the consolidation, which is what created this wretched too-big-to-fail phenomenon in the first place. The ideal system, the one we should aim at, is not a system where a bank can't fail, but a system where a bank can fail without it being a problem, without the taxpayer having to come and rescue it. In other words, where there is a plurality of small providers, each striving to offer a better service. We have the precise opposite of that. We have a series of zombie banks crawling malodorously with their bandages hanging off because we don't allow the market to take its natural course.
The corporatist system is the merger between state and corporate powers, basically where the state and corporations are in bed with each other. Of course, there's the difference between the market entrepreneurs and political entrepreneurs. What socialists try to convince you, the likes of Noam Chomsky, etc., they want you to believe that somehow they're one of the same, as if there is no difference. The truth of the matter is, there is a strong difference between a market entrepreneur and a political entrepreneur. Have a listen to this guy.
You're well known for your book, A Brief History of Neoliberalism, in which you very clearly say that neoliberalism was first and foremost a political project devised by the corporate capitalist class towards the late 1960s and early 1970s to consolidate class power.
I saw neoliberalism as a way of talking about the emergence of a political project. It really sort of had its roots in the 1960s, but I think became more and more urgent in the 1970s because the capitalist class was losing power.
So as you can hear, he's trying to convince you that somehow they are the same thing. An example of a market entrepreneur would be that of James J. Hill of the late 19th century in the railroad industry, or even Cornelius Vanderbilt with the steamships. And of course, if you look at a political entrepreneur would be that of the likes of Edward Collins of the steamship industry of the 19th century. In other words, a political entrepreneur is not the same thing. In fact, a political entrepreneur is anti-capitalist because they are very much against the free market. They seek to destroy the free market through special interest favours that they get from government. So in other words, a political entrepreneur of what you see today is not a capitalist. A capitalist is someone who supports the free market. You cannot claim to be capitalist at the same time as opposing the capitalist system. It's an oxymoron. A capitalist system is the free market. A capitalist system is not some mixed economy. It's important to make the distinction between what politicians say and that of what they put into practice. You've got economic reality to take into account, as well, of course, politicians are faced with the severe pressure. Now, Margaret Thatcher had mentioned this herself. She mentioned how the Conservative Party, prior to her being Prime Minister, anytime they tried to make ground in the economy, the Socialists would break out in riots. You've seen that with all the strikes, etc. There's always this severe pressure, and the politicians eventually back down and they cower and they've not got a backbone, and you've seen that with a lot of these politicians. Things are not so black and white. They're trying to say that just because Margaret Thatcher spoke a word about free market economics, that this somehow means that, that must mean that this is the example of the free market economy. She could speak the rhetoric about a free market economy, but does that mean to say somehow free market economics was put into practice? Of course we weren't living under a free market economy. It's a mixed economy. They're trying to say that they're the same thing. That's why they're saying, oh well, it was this neoliberal period of, classical liberalism. Just because politicians say one thing, it doesn't mean to say that that's what it is in practice. Thatcher would have been under severe pressure. You take, for example, that of the British NHS. Just look at the reaction you would get for just speaking about privatising the NHS.
Last year, our daughter was in a coma for 2 weeks. It did occur to me about a week in, watching her with her tubes and her 11 drips, that by this time in America, I'd be thinking of remortgaging the house.
Politicians are reliant upon the fact that they need to win your vote. And how are they going to win your vote if you're speaking about privatising the NHS? In the real world, in today's Britain, most people support the NHS, unfortunately.
It's very important people don't have to worry not only about getting ill, but about the financial consequences of getting ill. And it's worth fighting for.
That doesn't mean to say that because the majority support the NHS that somehow means that they understand what they're talking about. The only way that you can really get rid of this is not through the voting system. It's basically doing what the United States of America have done. They've done the right thing in bringing in the direct primary care system, so there's actually an alternative there. Of course, there is a restriction on the market. You can only do things through gradualism. But that's what I mean. It's not so as simple as just saying, well, politicians are in, here's Margaret Thatcher speaking all the rhetoric about free market economics and individualism, etc., and self-interest and how that will better the economy, and then, of what's put into practice. See, what socialists are trying to convince you, and you can even hear this from this lassie here.
It's pretty tragically ironic that markets were originally seen as good because they were thought to respond to human nature and human behavior, whereas now it's pretty much universally accepted that our duty as humans is to respond to markets. Under neoliberalism, we are reconfigured as pieces of human capital that really must develop the right skill at the right time, in the right place in order to respond to market demands. And remember, since the mandate is to privatize everything so that it is a for-profit corporation, humans are no exception to that. So meet your new life purpose, which is to be an entrepreneur of the self and really think about running your life like a successful business.
They want you to believe that somehow this is the individualism you're living under today. It really isn't. This young lassie's a wee bit of an exception, to be fair, because she just doesn't understand. They're speaking in the rhetoric as if to say that they are living under capitalism, and this is what they confuse. Just because a politician speaks about free market economics, and just because they speak the rhetoric of all this stuff, it doesn't mean to say that we are living under that. And it's far from it. I wish that was the case, that we were living under a free market economy, but it just isn't the real world of how things are today. This goes back to the whole argument on all the myths about capitalism. This is what the critics argue. This is what they try to describe as neoliberalism, which they try to, claim is capitalism. They use all these myths about that of capitalism leading to monopoly creation. Again, they try to say that it's deregulation that leads to this. Again, complete opposite of the truth. Again, it's the same thing with that of the claims about the boom and bust cycle. There is a concession by many socialists. They acknowledge the fact that the laws of supply and demand is what would determine the market. Of course, you would hear this here.
That the market is the key actor through which good outcomes are to be sought, right? Because it only responds to, hypothetically, it only responds to the laws of supply and demand. Commodities are naturally going to price themselves according to how much they're needed in society. And then in come classical liberals a few decades later and sort of pushed this ideology even further. Unlike Adam Smith, who didn't actually think that every service should be thought of as a commodity, classical liberal theorists did. So neoliberalism, which is the era that we find ourselves in now, is basically the extension of classical liberal principles magnified times like a million.
So it's not like they don't acknowledge what capitalism's about in terms of leaving it to the laws of supply and demand. They do acknowledge. That's acknowledging the fact that capitalism is leaving interest rates be to the free market. Of course, they could try and deny as much as they want. It's not socialism that's caused this problem with fixing of interest rates. Well, of course it is. They're basically speaking about today's system. They're not speaking about a free market. It tells you that they don't even understand what a free market economy is. So really all the system is basically cronyism or corporatism. Sometimes they use the term monopoly capitalism. It's basically just strangled capitalism half to death through all the socialism. Of course, this is why you've seen the collusion in the private pharmaceutical industry in the United States. It's the very reason why you've seen the collusion with the giant supermarkets in Great Britain who are able to exploit the farmers because of government's intervention. It has basically hindered the market. And even more recently, I gave the example from the Mises Institute by Mackenzie, and he pointed out, of course, about the Telecommunications Act and how even conceding in their own report, they go on to say that it was government's intervention through the regulatory power that resulted in, of course, costs driving up and why there's so much consolidation and barriers to entry to the market. Again, it's all the fault of government, but for some strange reason, these people try to project the blame off onto the market and say, well, it's the freedom of the market that created this problem. Again, capitalism getting the blame for what was never the fault of capitalism. Again, Second Thought is very much like that, or Joe Scott, or many of these anti-capitalist critics. So I hope that's been informative for yourself. If you've got anything you would like to ask, comment in the comments section below and I'll be sure to get back to you. Be sure to like the video, share the video and whatnot. And of course, thank you for watching. Cheers.